Hi everyone, it's Clive. Welcome to the Mitchell Brewery. It's another brew day. I've got the boiler on. I've got my ingredients ready. The boiler is, oh, it's getting there. It's over 90 degrees. So let's crack on. Happy brew day. Today I'm going to make what I call Home Pale IPA, and this uses Otter Pale Malt, Crystal Malt, Caramalt, Torrefied wheat and porridge. And for my hops, I'm going to start with Galaxy at the beginning of the boil, add Nelson Sauvin 10 minutes from the end, and East Kent Goldings at the end, and I'll dry hop with Nelson Sauvin. My boil is now at 100. This has taken about an hour and a half. Tap water was about 8 degrees C when it went in, and it's taken an hour and a half to heat to 100. And you can see I've got my fan on, so I don't do that. You can see all this steam. It soon fogs up in here, and the place will be dripping with condensation, so we don't want that. So what I do now, I turn off my boiler and let that cool down. Now this needs to cool to less than 80 degrees C for the next stage. Keeping things clean and sterilised is pretty crucial in brewing. You don't want your hard efforts to be spoiled by a beer that's caught a bug. So what I do, I use this stuff, and as I always say, if it's good enough for babies, it's good enough for beer. What I do, I add a couple of these little tablets in here, put a bit of boiling water in it just to dissolve them, and then top it up, and let them sit for a while I'm doing the rest of the brewing, and that will have a nice clean container at the end. This is the mash tun, and it pretty much looks like a cool box. That's been converted. You can see they've added a tap. If I take the lid off, what you'll see they've also done, they've added this sort of like pipe work and this sort of mesh. And what we do, we add 10 litres of this water when it's less than 80, and then we add all the malt in here and stir it up like porridge, stick the lid on and leave it for an hour and a half, and that then dissolves the sugar out of the malt. 10 litres of water in the mash tun ready, and ready now to start adding the malt. So I'll just show you one of these. This is the Otter Pale Malt. Now this is the backbone of the beer. I'm going to have 5 kilograms. The rest are only in sort of 50 to 100 grams. So here we go. You can see the white stuff coming from my fingers there. That's basically the sugar from the grain. So what this is barley, which has been malted. So basically what that means is they start the sort of germination process of barley, and they then stop it, and then they kiln the malt, and then the varying degrees of kilning, i.e. the temperature, the higher the temperature the darker the malt, and that accounts for the colour of beer. So if it's a light malt like this one, you get a pale beer. If it's a darker malt like these ones, you get a darker colour in the beer, and you get black malt, chocolate malts, and you get really dark beers. And they add a sort of like quite darker sort of chocolatey coffee taste to the beer as well. So I'm going to add 5 kilograms now. Now all the malt is added, I have to give it a really good stir. The idea being that I want all of the grain in contact with water to dissolve every last bit of sugar on this malt. So I need to do this quickly. It'll look a little bit porridgey when I finish, and then I'll wrap it up for an hour and a half. There you go, nicely stirred up. So I should pop the lid on. And I've got a cover which I'm going to pop over the top of it just to give it a little bit of extra insulation. Well, that'll then sit for an hour and a half, and there's no rest for the wicked. What I've got to do now is I've got to top my boiler up and then get this back to boiling, because this is what I'll be using to sparge the mash, and I'll explain what that means in the next bit. Night night sweet mash, see you in an hour and a half. Well, I've got a bit of a gap in the brewing schedule. I thought I'd tell you the story of the broken boiler bitter. There we go, looks pretty good, like that looks pretty spot on. Well, back in the first lockdown, coronavirus lockdown 2020, I thought, well, okay, let's make a beer. And like in a lot of the best sort of lockdown situations, I did a bit of a store cupboard beer. So I got all my ingredients together, what I had, and I thought, right, let's make a beer. And I've got the gear, I've got the equipment, and my boiler, this is a good old thing, I've had it for years, and it's been brilliant. However, on this particular occasion, I just finished extracting the malt, so this thing is full of sort of malty, sticky, syrupy solution, so it's full up to the top, and it won't go beyond 70. It just cuts out and refuses to go beyond 70 degrees C, and that's not boiling. So what do? scratched my head. I thought, what the hey, why don't I just stick it in a fermenter, see what we can make out of it. And this is the result. It's fantastic. The only problem is this stuff has a very distinctive flavour. Which I can only describe as the taste of TCP, which doesn't sound fantastic. And one of my brewing friends said, well, the problem is boiling drives off the chlorine that's added to tap water to sterilise it. So I thought, oh my god, what I've done, I've actually brewed the chlorine into the beer. So it's not been driven off by the boiling process, because normally that malt would have sat in here for an hour and a half and all of that taste would have disappeared, would have evaporated. So here you go, hence the broken boiler bitter, which I'm ashamed to admit, even though it looks great, I've never released it, as it were, to the general public. I've just kept it for my own consumption. 100 degrees C, up for the second time today, and we're steaming up. Time for one of my favourite stages in the brewing processes, which is where we wake up the mash tun. Let's take off the cover and remove the lid. Oh, what a glorious ovaltine, malty, lovely sweet smell that is. This is brewing. Fantastic. Okay, what do we do next? So we've revealed the mash tun, and what we need to do is we need to drain off some of that water. Look at that. That is now full of sugary goodness from the malts. And the reason I drain off this first splash of solution is basically this is probably loaded with sediment, which I'm going to stick back through here. This acts as a filter bed. Next step will be then to wash the malt using this wash water through this rosemer from a watering can, and I basically just sprinkle this across. All this water goes through here to wash off all the remaining sugar into here. This becomes what is known as sweet wort, which goes back in the boiler, and then we add the hops. Right, this is the sparging process, and you can see all I'm doing is washing the surface of the grain. All of this water will go through this grain and into a container, and probably my backup container as well. This will take a little while. It's going to take me about 15-20 minutes to push all this water through this grain. I've transferred the sweet wort from these buckets into the boiler. This is going to go back on. You can see it's always 56 degrees. It's really consistent when you do this. So I'm going to stick this back on, get this back up to boiling, and I'm going to start adding the hops. Just sorting out the hops to add. In the past, most of the hops I used were what they were described as flake hops, which are basically the hop cone which have been dried and compressed. Now most hops are pellet hops, like this, and I'm not very keen on them. They sort of they're hops, but basically this is like compressed powder, so when it goes into the boiler it just breaks right down into a mush. So I tend to use one of these containers or a hop bag, basically just to contain that mush. Otherwise you end up with a very sort of cloudy beer. So that's what I'm doing. So the sweet wort is now at 100 degrees C, and I put those pellet hops into this container. I'm just going to pop this into here. When I do this, this will then start converting the sweet wort to bitter wort. So there we go, this is going to be now boiling for an hour and a half. This is the yeast I'm using today, and what I've done, I've got some water, it's 110 mils, which I've boiled and cooled to less than 30 degrees because any hotter than it will kill the yeast. And all I'm going to do is just tip the yeast in and let it sit there, and then give it a stir in about 15 minutes. And what it does is hydrates the yeast before you add it to your beer later. It's about 10 minutes from the end of the boil. I'm going to add the copper chiller. This will go in the boiler, and the boiling will actually sterilise the chiller while it's in there. Yep, that's the end of the hot boil. Time to turn on the chiller. Hopefully this is the good stuff. This is the bitter wort going into the fermentation bin, which will then go in the house with the yeast to ferment. So I've got 20 litres, I've got my yeast which is going to go in there. This will then stay here in a hallway for about a week, and then the next stage will be to decant into bottles with more priming sugar for bottle conditioning. 8 days later and the primary fermenter has done its thing. I'm now ready to decant this first into my pressure barrel, then I'm going to put it into bottles. I've already added some finings to the pressure barrel. I've got some priming sugar. I'm actually switching to this stuff called spray malt light, which I'm going to substitute for sugar. I've sterilised everything, so as usual I'm using Milton's. What I normally do, take one of these tablets in a washing up bowl, fill it with water, add to the bottles, top them up, and then leave them. I mean, they've been there probably for about 4 or 5 days. Then I rinse it out, I fill it with water, empty it out, and then fill it with water, so they're just soaking in water now, ready for beer to be added. So let's crack on. Let's have a quick look inside the fermenter. There we go. That's all lovely, and you can see some sediment at the bottom. A couple of days ago I added a hop tea bag to dry hop the beer, so hopefully that's added a bit more flavour to the beer. Got the siphon going, so I'm going to siphon off into the pressure barrel, and I'm going to take on about 200 ml so I can do the hydrometer test as well. As well as the priming sugar I've added into here, I'm going to add an extra 10 ml of a sugary solution to each of the bottles as a little extra priming. Technical issues with my bottling one means I'm going to revert to my old true and trusted method of topping up my bottles using a jug. 40 bottles filled up. Now I'm just going to put on the caps, and then we're one step away from finishing. Well, that's a very satisfying sight. 40 bottles of Home Pale IPA all bottled up. That'll sit in the bottle now for 4 weeks, so that'll be ready just after Christmas 2020. I'm really happy with that. Cheers everyone, happy brewing!